You're done. Get out of my house. Min Yoon didn't raise his voice to say it. He never needed to. The whole room went cold around those 5 words, and Odessa Grant stood there in front of 30 people who worked under her for the last 2 years, absorbing a public firing over a phone call she wasn't allowed to explain. 12 minutes later, a 7-year-old boy tore through that same house, screaming one word nobody in that family had ever heard him use for her. Mommy. If you know anything about grief or shame or the kind of secret that eats a person alive for years, you already know that word wasn't a mistake. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because what happens after that word gets said out loud in front of a room full of dangerous people is going to make you rethink everything you think you know about the woman who just got fired. And if stories like this hit different for you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you do not want to lose this one halfway through. There's something almost cruel about timing. The universe doesn't usually hand you justice with a stopwatch running. It usually makes you wait years for the truth to matter to the people who need to hear it. But every once in a while, karma doesn't wait. Every once in a while, it walks straight into the room 12 minutes after you've humiliated someone, wraps its arms around your leg, and calls her mommy in front of everyone you were trying to impress. Her name was Odessa Grant. This is the story of how a woman who once left a newborn baby in a basket at a stranger's gate, believing she was giving him the only safety she couldn't provide, ended up working 2 feet from that same man for 2 years, watching over that same child in secret, and getting fired the same night the truth finally found her anyway. But let me back up, because you need to understand who she was before any of this. Odessa was 26 the year everything changed, working 3 jobs just to keep her apartment, the kind of tired that doesn't have a bottom. She believed, back then, that hard work eventually gets noticed. She believed people paid their debts, that good intentions mattered even when life didn't cooperate with them, and that the worst thing she'd ever have to survive was rent. She was wrong about all 3, and she'd spend the next 7 years finding that out the hard way. That was the year she met Min Yoon, though neither of them would call it meeting. It was one night, blurred at the edges even for him, a night he'd spent years trying not to think about too closely. She remembered more of it than he did. She remembered leaving before sunrise. She remembered never telling him her name. She did not know, walking out of that hotel room, that she was already carrying the one thing that would define the rest of her life. The morning Odessa Grant left her son at the gate of the Yoon estate, she didn't knock. She wrapped him in the only blanket she owned that didn't have a hole in it, tucked a folded note under his chin, and walked away before the sun came up, the same way she'd walked away from his father 7 years earlier without leaving a name. The note said 3 things: that his father was Min Yoon, that she couldn't protect him the way he deserved to be protected, that whoever raised him should tell him, someday, that he was loved before he ever took his first breath. She didn't stay to see who found him. She couldn't. If she'd stayed 1 more minute, she wasn't sure she'd have been able to leave at all. The Yoon family ran the DNA test within the week. Min remembered enough of that blurred night to know it wasn't impossible, and something about the note, about the specific fear in the handwriting, told him whoever had written it wasn't lying and wasn't looking for money. He never found her. He hired people who searched for years and came back with nothing every time, because Odessa Grant had learned, by then, exactly how to disappear from people with resources. She named the boy in her head before she ever knew what name they'd give him. It didn't matter. They named him Jun Seo, and by the time Odessa found her way back into his life, that was the only name he'd ever known. Here's what nobody in that house understood for 2 years. Odessa didn't come back as his mother. She came back as a stranger applying for a job, using a name that was close enough to survive a background check and different enough that nobody connected it to a young woman who'd vanished from a hospital 7 years earlier without signing a birth certificate. She'd spent those years building herself into someone employable. Business administration courses paid for in installments she could barely afford. A reference network built slow and careful. She told herself, applying for the position of executive secretary to Min Yoon, that she only wanted to see him, just see him, confirm he was safe, healthy, loved, and then leave quietly the way she'd arrived. She got the job, she did not leave quietly, she couldn't. The first time she saw Jun Seo in person, he was 5 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of his father's study drawing something nobody had asked him to draw, ignored by the 3 assistants in the room who'd stopped noticing children needed noticing. Odessa sat down on the floor next to him without thinking about whether that was appropriate for a woman on her first week of employment. He looked up at her like she was the only adult who'd looked at him all day. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "A dragon. Nobody believes dragons are real." "I believe you." He'd looked at her for a long moment, the particular assessing look small children give adults who might actually mean what they say, and then he'd slid the drawing across the floor toward her like an offering. Odessa had to excuse herself to the hallway 5 minutes later, where she stood with both hands pressed against her mouth, shaking, because she had held her son for exactly 4 minutes after he was born, and here he was, 5 years old, giving her a dragon he drew because nobody else in the room had bothered to ask. She never told him. She told herself 100 times over the next 2 years that she would, someday, when it was safer, when she understood the shape of the danger surrounding this family well enough to know exactly how much a truth like that could cost him. That day never seemed to come. There was always another threat first. Taemin noticed her competence before he noticed anything else about her, which was exactly how she wanted it. She read every contract twice. She caught a supplier padding invoices in her 3rd month and said nothing to anyone but him, quietly, in a way that let him handle it without losing face in front of his own people. She remembered which of his associates couldn't be trusted in a room alone and rearranged meeting schedules without ever being asked to. Within a year, he'd stopped making major decisions without asking what she thought first, the way a man does when he's stopped noticing he's doing it. He never once considered why a woman that careful, that quietly devoted to his son's safety specifically, might have reasons that went beyond a paycheck. That blindness had a name, and her name was Grace Sa. Grace had been circling this family for 3 years by the time Odessa arrived, a longtime family friend whose own daughter she'd been quietly positioning as a future match for Taemin since before his wife died in a car accident that Odessa had learned about only after taking the job, one more piece of grief layered under the one she already carried in silence. Grace was polished in a way that photographed well and calculated in a way that never showed on camera. She'd built her influence in that house through patience, through favors owed, through the particular skill of making herself indispensable to people who didn't examine why. She noticed Odessa within the 1st month, not because Odessa was doing anything wrong, because Taemin had started asking a secretary's opinion on things he'd never asked anyone's opinion on before, and Grace understood, with the instant clarity of someone who'd spent 3 years building toward a specific outcome, exactly what that kind of trust could cost her if it kept growing unchecked. "You're good with him," Grace said to Odessa once, early on, meaning Jun Seo, watching the boy laugh at something Odessa had said with an ease he rarely showed strangers. "He's easy to be good with." "Most children aren't with strangers." Grace's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You have a natural gift for this, almost unnervingly natural." Odessa had felt the warning underneath the compliment and filed it away without responding to it, the way she'd learned to file away every small danger in that house, cataloging threats the way another woman might catalog compliments. She didn't know yet that Grace would spend the next 2 years watching her the way a hawk watches a field, patient, waiting for the one mistake that would justify removing her. The vulnerability windows were rare, but they happened. Late one night, working through a contract dispute with Taemin long after the house had gone quiet, Odessa let something slip past the careful wall she kept between herself and every conversation involving his son. "You worry about him more than most secretaries would," Taemin said, not accusing, just noticing. "He lost his mother. Somebody should worry about him properly. Most people in my position hire people to worry so they don't have to feel it themselves." Odessa had looked up from the contract then, something raw crossing her face for exactly 1 second before she caught it and buried it again. Then I suppose I'm bad at my job description. Min had studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that neither of them examined closely enough that night. And then he'd gone back to the contract, and the moment passed the way most dangerous moments do in a house built on careful control, unspoken and unresolved. Grace saw the exchange from the doorway. She didn't say anything either. She simply began, that night, building a file. Because Grace had learned a long time ago that in a house like this one, the woman who cared too much, too specifically, too consistently about one particular child was either exactly what she appeared to be, or she was the single greatest threat sitting quietly in plain sight. Grace intended to find out which, and she intended to be the one holding the answer when it finally mattered. The deal that ended everything had nothing to do with Odessa at first. It belonged to a shipping contract Min had spent 4 months negotiating, a partnership with a distribution network that ran straight through territory his organization needed to control before a rival family locked it down first. Money wasn't the only thing riding on it. Reputation was. In Min's world, a man who lost a deal like this one didn't just lose money. He lost the appearance of inevitability that kept smaller players from testing him. Odessa found out 3 days before the signing that the shipping partner had a second, quieter relationship with a man named Sunwoo Beek, a mid-level enforcer who'd been circling Junseo's school pickup schedule for 2 weeks under the cover of routine security work Min had never actually authorized. She recognized the pattern before anyone else did, because she'd spent 2 years learning to see danger shaped exactly like this. Not an attack, a positioning. Somebody building leverage quietly, patiently, the way you build leverage against a man by getting close to the one thing he'd burn his entire empire down to protect. She didn't go to Min first. That was her first mistake, though she wouldn't understand it as a mistake until much later. She went around him, quietly reaching out to a contact inside the distribution network, killing the deal from the inside before it could close, before Sunwoo Beek's positioning near Junseo's school ever became relevant enough to matter. She did it clean, she did it fast. And she did it without telling Min why, because the why involved things about her own past she still wasn't ready to explain, threads that led directly back to a night neither of them had ever spoken about, and a truth she'd buried under 2 years of careful silence. The deal collapsed publicly, expensively, embarrassingly, 3 days before signing, and everyone in Min's organization assumed incompetence on someone's part. Nobody assumed sabotage from inside his own office, because nobody imagined his most trusted secretary would ever risk that kind of exposure without an explanation ready. Min called her into his office the morning the news broke fully, the number attached to the loss already circulating among people who'd been waiting for a reason to question his judgment. "Explain this to me," he said, and his voice had none of the warmth it had carried in that late-night conversation weeks earlier. "Explain to me how a deal I spent 4 months building fell apart 3 days before signing, and why my own office appears to be the reason." Odessa stood very still. Everything in her wanted to tell him the truth. Sunwoo Beek, the school pickup schedule, the specific surgical danger circling his son that she'd recognized because she'd spent 2 years watching for exactly this kind of threat with a vigilance nobody else in that house could explain, because nobody else in that house had a reason like hers. But telling him meant telling him why. And telling him why meant unraveling 7 years of careful disappearance in a single sentence, in a room where Grace happened to be standing near the door, arms crossed, watching with an expression Odessa recognized instantly as a woman waiting for exactly this moment. "I made a judgment call," Odessa said instead. "I can't fully explain the reasoning right now." "You can't, or you won't." "Both." Min's expression hardened into something Odessa had never seen aimed at her before. Not confusion, not curiosity. Cold, absolute authority, the version of him his enemies feared, standing 3 feet away from her instead of across a negotiating table. "I built this office on the understanding that everyone in it answers to me first," he said, "not their own judgment, not their own agenda, mine." I understand that. Then you understand why I can't have someone in this position who makes unilateral decisions, costing me this kind of money, without explaining why. If you'll give me a day, I can explain everything. I'm not giving you a day. His voice had dropped into something final. I'm giving you an exit. Grace shifted near the doorway, something satisfied moving behind her eyes that Odessa caught and understood too late to do anything about. There are people gathering downstairs for the quarterly family dinner in 20 minutes, T-Min continued. You will not be attending. You will clear your desk tonight. Odessa felt something crack open in her chest, not for herself, not entirely. For the 4 minutes downstairs, 20 minutes from now, when Jun Seo would come looking for her the way he did every evening around this time, and she wouldn't be there, and nobody would explain to him why the one adult who'd never once made him feel invisible had simply disappeared from his life without a goodbye. Can I at least say goodbye to Jun Seo? Something flickered across T-Min's face at the question, something almost like suspicion, quickly buried. No, this ends cleanly, tonight. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him everything right there. The basket, the note, the DNA test he'd run 7 years ago that had confirmed a truth he'd never fully solved. The years of careful distance she'd kept specifically so a moment like this one would never force her hand before she was ready. But pride and fear and the particular exhaustion of a woman who'd spent her whole life being disbelieved the moment things got complicated kept her silent. Fine, she said instead. I'll clear my desk. She turned to leave. Grace's voice stopped her at the door, pitched just loud enough to carry. For what it's worth, Grace said, I did try to warn him you were hiding something. Odessa didn't turn around. You have no idea what you almost warned him about. She said it quiet enough that only Grace heard it, and something in Odessa's tone made Grace's satisfied expression falter for just a second. The first crack of uncertainty in a plan she'd believed was already finished. 20 minutes later, downstairs, in front of 30 members of an extended family gathering for quarterly dinner, T-Min made the firing public. Not because he needed to, because Grace had suggested, quietly, in the hallway between his office and the dining room, that a clean public example would prevent anyone else in his organization from believing unauthorized decisions came without consequences. You're done, T-Min said, in front of everyone. Get out of my house. Odessa stood there and absorbed it, the humiliation, the eyes of 30 people who'd respected her a week ago, now watching her the way you watch someone being publicly discarded. And she said nothing in her own defense, because the only defense she had would have changed everything in that room permanently, and she wasn't ready. She turned to leave. She made it exactly to the front entrance before the first scream came from upstairs. Jun Seo's missing. The house that had just watched her get humiliated erupted into a different kind of chaos entirely. Guards fanning out through hallways, T-Min's controlled expression cracking wide open for the first time all evening. And Odessa felt every instinct she'd spent 2 years burying override every ounce of pride she had left. She turned back toward the house that had just thrown her out and ran. She found him before the guards did, because she was the only person in that house who understood exactly where a frightened 7-year-old would go. Not toward the noise. Away from it, into the old sunroom off the east corridor where nobody spent time anymore, curled behind a stack of storage boxes with his knees pulled to his chest, shaking. Jun Seo. He looked up and something in his small face broke open at the sight of her, relief and terror tangled together in a way that told her he'd heard exactly what happened downstairs, had understood in whatever way a 7-year-old understands adult cruelty, that she was leaving and nobody was going to explain why. He didn't walk to her. He ran, past the guard who'd finally caught up to the doorway behind her, past his own father who arrived seconds later out of breath and pale in a way none of his employees had ever witnessed, straight into Odessa's arms with a force that nearly knocked her backward. Mommy! The word landed in that room like something physical. Odessa felt her whole body go still, arms already wrapped around him before her mind caught up to what he just said out loud, in front of T-Min, in front of the guard, in front of Grace Sir, who'd arrived at the doorway a half-second later and gone white as paper. Taemin didn't move. For several long seconds, nobody in that room moved. Ethan, he started, then caught himself, correcting the wrong name in his own head, disoriented in a way Odessa had never seen from him. Jun Seo, what did you just say? The boy didn't loosen his grip. If anything, he held tighter, face buried against Odessa's shoulder, the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided, correctly or not, that saying something out loud makes it more true, not less. She's my mommy. She's not your. Taemin stopped himself again, staring at Odessa over his son's head, something moving behind his eyes that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago when he'd fired her in front of 30 people. Confusion first. Then, slowly, something closer to dread. Jun Seo, Odessa said gently, crouching despite the boy's grip, bringing herself down to his height the way she'd learned to do in every hard moment they'd shared over 2 years. Look at me. He shook his head, face still pressed against her. You're safe, I'm right here. Only then did his arms loosen slightly, enough that she could see his face, red and wet, and frightened in the specific way of a child who just watched an adult he trusted get thrown out of his home. Taemin crouched slowly beside them, his voice careful in a way Odessa had rarely heard from him. Why did you say that? Jun Seo didn't answer. He looked at Odessa instead, silently asking permission for something neither of them had a name for yet. Not here, Odessa said quietly, meeting Taemin's eyes over his son's head. Not with him listening, not with an audience. For the first time since she'd known him, Taemin didn't argue with her, didn't pull rank, didn't demand the answer on his own timeline. He looked around the room instead, at the guard hovering near the door, at Grace standing frozen in the hallway, with an expression that had gone from satisfaction to something closer to panic in the span of 90 seconds. Everyone out, he said. Nobody moved fast enough for him. He said it again, harder, and the room emptied within seconds, guards and staff and extended family who'd gathered at the sound of the commotion, all of them retreating down the hallway with the particular urgency of people who understood exactly how dangerous this man became when something he couldn't control had just happened in his own house. Grace lingered half a step longer than everyone else. She should leave too, Odessa said, not looking at her. Grace's composure cracked slightly. Excuse me. You heard me. Odessa kept her attention on Jun Seo, but her voice carried enough weight that Grace's feet stayed rooted for exactly one more second before Taemin's expression turned toward her, cold and unreadable. Grace, he said, give us the room. For the first time in 3 years of careful positioning inside this family, Grace Sir had no argument ready. She left without another word, though the look she threw back at Odessa on her way out carried a promise neither of them needed to say out loud. This wasn't over. When the door closed, it was just the three of them, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened downstairs 20 minutes earlier. Explain it to me, Taemin said quietly, not a command this time, something closer to a plea, though he'd have denied that if asked. Please. Odessa looked down at Jun Seo, still holding tight to her sleeve, watching her with the specific attention of a child who sensed something enormous was about to happen and didn't want to miss it. 7 years ago, she said slowly, I left a baby at the gate of this house in a basket with a note. I didn't sign it. I didn't stay to see who found him. Taemin went very still. The note said his father was Taemin Yoon. The color that had already left his face somehow found a way to drain further. His eyes moved from Odessa to his son, then back, doing math he'd apparently done once before, 7 years ago, and buried the moment the DNA results confirmed a truth he'd never been able to attach to a face. You, he said, the word coming out barely above a whisper. You're the woman who... Yes. You've been working 2 feet from me for 2 years. His voice had gone hollow, disbelief and fury, and something rower than either fighting for space behind his eyes. You've been raising him under my own roof, watching him, protecting him, and you never, I was afraid, Odessa said, and for the first time since walking into that estate 2 years earlier, she let every ounce of exhaustion she'd been carrying show plainly on her face. I was afraid of exactly this moment. I was afraid of what it would cost him if the truth came out before I understood how dangerous the world around him actually was. You should have told me. I was going to, her voice cracked slightly. I promise you I was going to, I just kept waiting for it to be safe enough, and it never was, and now. She stopped, looking down at Junseo, who was staring up at both of them with the particular stillness of a child absorbing something too large for him to fully understand yet, but understanding enough. Are you really my mommy? He asked quietly. Odessa's composure, held together through 2 years of secrecy and 20 minutes of public humiliation, finally broke completely. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and Junseo pressed himself back into her arms with a certainty that had nothing to do with DNA tests or basket notes or anything either adult in that room could have explained to him. He'd simply always known, in whatever way children know things adults spend years talking themselves out of, that she was the safest person in his life. Now he had a word for why. Taemin stood slowly, running a hand over his face, 20 minutes removed from firing the mother of his own child in front of 30 witnesses without knowing it, and Odessa watched something in him fracture that she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see. I need to verify this, he said, though his voice carried none of the authority the words were supposed to hold. Properly, a test. I understand. And I need to understand why you left him. His eyes found hers again, something raw underneath the demand. Why you left him at my gate instead of coming to me directly. Odessa thought about that night 7 years ago, about a young woman with no money, no name he'd remember, and no way to know whether announcing herself to a man in his line of work would put a newborn in more danger than leaving him quietly with people who could actually protect him. Because I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed, she said, than what would happen if I disappeared. Outside the closed door, unseen by either of them, Grace stood in the hallway with her phone already in her hand, scrolling backward through old files she'd been quietly compiling for months, searching for exactly the kind of leverage that could turn tonight's revelation into tomorrow's weapon. The DNA results came back 48 hours later, delivered privately to Taemin's office by a lab technician sworn to silence under threat neither Odessa nor anyone else needed explained. 99.9%. Confirmed a second time, 7 years after the first confirmation nobody had ever been able to attach to a living face. Taemin read the report twice, sitting alone in his study long after everyone else in the house had gone to bed, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that the woman he had built 2 years of trust around, the woman he had fired publicly over deals she'd sacrificed to protect his son from a danger she'd correctly identified before anyone else in his organization had, was the same woman who'd carried his child, delivered him alone, and left him at a gate because she believed that was the safest thing she could do for a baby she couldn't protect any other way. He hadn't slept in 2 days, it showed. Odessa hadn't been dismissed from the house, not officially, not since the DNA results confirmed what Junseo had already known without proof. But she also hadn't been reinstated, hadn't been given a title, hadn't been told what she was allowed to be inside this family now that the secret she'd guarded for 2 years had detonated in front of 30 witnesses and a lab report. She existed, for the moment, in a strange suspended space, staying in a guest wing because Junseo had refused to sleep unless he knew she was somewhere in the house, while Taemin avoided being in the same room with her for longer than necessary. It was Grace who ended the suspension, though not the way either of them expected. She called for a family meeting 3 days after the results, framing it as a necessary conversation about moving forward properly. And by the time Odessa understood what Grace actually intended, the room was already full. Senior family members and 2 of Taemin's most trusted associates gathered around the same dining table where Odessa had once been publicly fired. I think it's important, Grace said, standing at the head of the table with the same composed authority she'd used for 3 years to position herself precisely where she wanted to be, that everyone understands the full context of what's happened here. Taemin's jaw tightened. Grace. I'm not attacking anyone, Grace said smoothly. I simply think the family deserves to know that Miss Grant abandoned a newborn baby at this family's gate 7 years ago, disappeared without explanation, took a job under modified identity 2 years ago specifically to gain access to that same child without disclosing who she was, and then sabotaged a 4-month business deal that cost this family a significant sum, all without ever telling anyone the truth until she was caught. Odessa felt the room's attention shift toward her the way it had the last time Grace orchestrated exactly this kind of ambush, every eye recalculating, every assumption sliding backward from sympathy toward suspicion. That's not what happened, Odessa said. Isn't it? Grace's smile stayed perfectly composed. You lied about your identity. You concealed a child from his father for 7 years. You made unilateral decisions costing this family money without disclosing your motives. From where I'm standing, that looks less like protection and more like manipulation with a very long timeline. A murmur moved through the table. Odessa felt every old wound reopen at once, the particular cruelty of watching people decide what looked true before anyone asked what actually was. You cancelled a deal, Grace continued, turning toward Taemin now, that would have secured this family's position in an entire distribution territory, and the woman responsible has now conveniently revealed herself as the mother of your only son. Doesn't that timing concern anyone else in this room? Taemin's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness Odessa now understood, thanks to a lesson she'd taught him weeks earlier without either of them realizing it, was more frightening to the people around him than any raised voice could ever be. The deal collapsed, Odessa said, because a man named Sunwoo Baek had been circling Junseo's school pickup schedule for 2 weeks under cover of unauthorized security work connected to that same shipping partner. I killed the deal to remove the danger before it reached him. I didn't explain it at the time because explaining it meant explaining who I was, and I wasn't ready. The room went very quiet. That's a convenient story, Grace said, though something in her voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. It's not a story. Odessa reached into her bag, the same steady motion she'd used months earlier to produce evidence in a different negotiation entirely, and set a folder on the table. I documented everything, the surveillance pattern, the pickup schedule discrepancies, the connection between Baek and the shipping partner. I intended to bring this to you privately once I understood the full scope of the threat. I didn't get the chance before I was fired. Taemin reached for the folder. Grace's composure finally cracked as he opened it, scanning pages that confirmed, in careful, methodical detail, exactly the threat Odessa had described, a threat that had been circling his son for 2 weeks while his own security team remained unaware. You knew about this, he said slowly, looking up at Grace now instead of Odessa, and you're the one who suggested I make her firing public. Grace's face had gone pale. I didn't know the specifics of. You didn't ask. His voice had dropped into something dangerous. You saw an opportunity to remove someone whose closeness to my son threatened your position in this family, and you took it, regardless of what it cost him. That's not fair. Isn't it? He echoed her own words back at her, cold and precise. From where I'm standing, that looks less like family loyalty and more like manipulation with a very long timeline. Grace had no answer ready. For the first time in 3 years of careful positioning, the room's attention had turned fully against her, and she understood, watching every face at that table recalculate its assumptions a second time in one evening, that whatever influence she'd built inside this family had just collapsed in the space of 10 minutes. But the damage to Odessa wasn't fully undone. Several relatives still watched her with lingering suspicion, the particular kind that doesn't disappear just because one accusation gets disproven. A woman who could disappear for 7 years and then reappear inside a powerful man's household under a modified identity would always carry a question mark, however unfair the question mark might be. Odessa felt it settle over her, heavy and familiar, the specific exhaustion of a woman who'd spent her whole life being disbelieved the moment things got complicated, and understood that clearing her name in front of this family was going to take far more than one folder and one uncomfortable dinner. Min closed the folder slowly, looking at her across the table with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly, "alone." Grace watched them leave the room together, and beneath the humiliation still burning across her face, something colder and more calculating had already begun rebuilding itself, because a woman who has spent 3 years learning exactly how a family like this one operates does not surrender a position of influence over a single bad evening, however costly it looked in the moment. He took her to the study, the same room where he'd read the DNA results alone 2 nights earlier, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid between them filling the space more completely than words could have. "I owe you an apology," Min said finally, "more than one." "You don't owe me anything." Odessa's voice was tired in a way that went beyond the last 3 days. "I lied to you for 2 years. Whatever you said in that dining room in front of 30 people, I earned the suspicion that came with it." "You didn't lie, you omitted." He said it carefully, like he'd been turning the distinction over for 2 days and still wasn't fully certain of it. "There's a difference. Not one your family seems interested in." He had no answer for that, because she was right, and they both knew it. The silence stretched long enough that Odessa finally said the thing she'd been carrying since the moment Jun Seo had wrapped his arms around her in that sunroom. "I think I should leave." Min's head came up sharply. "What?" "Not tonight, not without explaining it to him properly." Her voice wavered slightly, the first crack in the composure she'd held together through 3 brutal days. "But I've spent 7 years believing my presence in his life put him at risk. Tonight proved I was right to believe that. Grace nearly destroyed both of us in front of your entire family in 10 minutes, and she'll try again, because people like her don't stop just because they lose 1 round. So your solution is to disappear a second time. My solution is to stop being the reason his life gets more dangerous." He just found his mother. Min's voice had risen slightly, something raw breaking through the careful control he usually wore like armor. "You think leaving now protects him more than staying?" "I think staying means every enemy you've ever made now has a second target. Me, and through me, him even more than before." Odessa's hands were shaking, though her voice stayed level through sheer force of will. "I've spent 2 years being invisible enough to keep him safe. I don't know how to be visible without putting him in more danger than I'm capable of protecting him from." "Then let me protect him. Let me protect both of you. You fired me in front of 30 people 3 days ago because a woman who resents me manipulated you into believing I couldn't be trusted." The words came out sharper than she intended, years of exhaustion finally finding an outlet. "You didn't ask for my side. You didn't investigate before you acted. You made a decision in about 90 seconds that nearly cost me everything. And now you're asking me to trust that you'll protect us better than I've been protecting us alone for 7 years. Min flinched like she'd hit him, because she had, with precision, in exactly the place that hurt most. "You're right," he said quietly, after a long moment. "I acted before I understood anything. That's who I've been for most of my life, and it's cost me more than I let myself admit most days. Then you understand why I can't just trust that this time will be different. I don't have a way to prove it will be different except by being different." He looked at her, something desperate underneath the careful control he was clearly fighting to maintain. "But I'm asking you not to leave before I get the chance to try." Odessa looked away first, toward the window, toward the dark grounds outside, where a basket had once sat at a gate 7 years ago, holding everything she couldn't bring herself to keep. "I need time," she said finally. "Not forever. Just time to figure out if staying is actually safer for him than leaving, or if I'm only telling myself that because I don't want to lose him again." Min nodded slowly, though something in his face suggested the answer cost him more than he let show. She left the estate that night anyway, not permanently, not without telling Jun Seo she'd be back, but far enough to breathe, renting a small room across the city where nobody knew her name or her history or the particular weight she'd been carrying for 7 years. Jun Seo cried when she left. She promised him she'd see him again soon. She wasn't entirely sure, walking out that gate a second time in her life, whether that promise would survive whatever Grace Suh had already started building in the 2 days since her humiliation. She found out 3 days later exactly how right she'd been to worry. Grace had spent those 3 days quietly reaching out to old contacts, calling in favors accumulated over years of careful positioning, and by the end of the week, a story had begun circulating through the parts of the city that mattered to a man like Min. A story about a former employee who'd concealed a child from a powerful family for years, who'd insinuated herself into a household under false pretenses, who couldn't be trusted around a vulnerable boy whose father's enemies would love nothing more than leverage exactly this specific and this personal. It wasn't framed as an accusation. It was framed as a concern, whispered carefully into the right ears, planted with the precision of someone who understood exactly how rumors travel through circles built on suspicion and self-interest. By the time Odessa learned about it, the damage had already started spreading beyond anything a single dinner table confrontation could undo. Her name, her history, the private details of a decision she'd made 7 years ago out of fear and love in equal measure, had become currency in a world that traded ruthlessly in exactly that kind of vulnerability. And somewhere in the middle of that spreading rumor, a second, more dangerous name had begun circulating alongside hers. Sunwoo Baek, the man whose surveillance pattern had triggered the whole crisis in the first place, resurfacing now with renewed interest in a woman whose connection to Min Yoon had just become public knowledge for the first time in 7 years. Odessa sat alone in her rented room that night, reading a message from an unknown number that contained nothing but 3 words. "We found you," and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that leaving the estate to protect her son had done nothing to protect either of them at all. It had only made them both easier to find. She called Min before she let herself think too hard about what calling him meant. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting for exactly this call for 3 days without admitting it to himself. "Someone found me," she said, no preamble, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 words, "We found you, unknown number." The silence on the other end lasted only a second before his voice came back different, sharper, the version of him that ran an organization instead of the version that had stood in his study 3 days ago asking her not to leave. "Where are you?" She told him the address, and 20 minutes later 2 cars pulled up outside her rented room, not the guards who'd chased her out of his house the night she was fired, but 2 men she recognized as part of the small circle Min had once told her he still trusted completely, back before either of them understood how thoroughly that circle needed rebuilding. Min arrived himself 20 minutes after that, and the moment he saw her standing safely in the doorway, something in his face broke open in a way Odessa hadn't seen from him even the night the DNA results confirmed everything. "I should have insisted you stay," he said, before she could say anything at all. "I told myself giving you space was respecting your boundary. I think I was just afraid of pushing too hard and losing you a second time." "You didn't lose me. I left because I thought it was safer. And now I think Grace made sure nothing about this was ever going to be safe, whether I stayed or left." Odessa's voice carried the specific exhaustion of a woman who'd spent 3 days confirming her worst fear was already coming true regardless of what she'd chosen. The rumor she started reached the wrong people faster than either of us expected. Min's jaw tightened. "Sunwoo Baek. I don't know yet. Maybe him. Maybe someone using the story he'd have wanted to use eventually anyway." She pulled her coat tighter, though the room wasn't cold. "Either way, hiding isn't protecting anyone anymore. It's just making us both easier targets one at a time instead of together." Something shifted behind Taemin's eyes, a decision forming that Odessa recognized instantly, because she'd watched this same man make exactly this kind of calculation 100 times over 2 years of working 2 feet from him, just never on her behalf. "Then we stop hiding," he said, "both of you, under my protection, properly, publicly, so there's no room left for a rumor to exploit. That means telling everyone the truth, all of it." "Yes." "That means your family, your associates, everyone who was in that dining room 3 days ago and everyone who wasn't, knowing exactly who I am and exactly what happened 7 years ago." Odessa searched his face for hesitation and found none. "Are you prepared for what that costs you?" "I've spent 7 years protecting a story instead of protecting my son properly," Taemin said. "I fired the mother of my child in front of 30 people because I was more concerned with looking decisive than being right. I think I've earned whatever this costs me." Odessa felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the particular relief of watching a man choose accountability over image for what might have been the first time in his adult life. "There's something else," she said. "Grace needs to be dealt with, not quietly, not with another private conversation she can spin into sympathy later. She started a rumor that put both of us in danger to protect her own position in your family. That can't just fade into an uncomfortable memory." "I agree. And I need you to actually listen when I tell you things," Odessa continued, something firmer entering her voice now. "Not investigate me first and apologize after. Listen first. That's the only version of this that works long-term for either of us." Taemin held her gaze for a long moment, and Odessa watched him do something she suspected very few people in his life had ever asked him to do successfully. He simply agreed, without negotiating the terms down, without softening the demand into something more comfortable for himself. "I can do that," he said. "I want to do that. That's not the same as being good at it yet." "No," he admitted. And something almost like a real smile crossed his face for the first time in days. "But I'd like the chance to get better at it, if you'll let me." Odessa studied him the way she'd learned to study everyone in that house over 2 careful years, looking for the gap between what someone said and what they actually meant. She didn't find one this time. "There's a family gathering in 4 days," she said finally. "The quarterly dinner Grace rescheduled after the last one fell apart." "I remember. I want to walk into that room as exactly who I am, not staff, not a secret. Jun Seo's mother, in front of everyone, with the truth about the last 2 years laid out plainly enough that nobody gets to whisper a different version of it afterward." Taemin nodded slowly. "And Grace? Grace gets exactly what she tried to give me, the truth in front of an audience with nowhere left to hide from it." Something settled between them then, not quite trust yet, not fully, but the outline of something that could become trust if both of them kept choosing it honestly instead of convenience. 4 days, Taemin said. 4 days, Odessa agreed, and for the first time since a 7-year-old boy had run past his father screaming a word nobody expected, she let herself believe that maybe, finally, the truth could be a weapon that protected them instead of one that only ever seemed to cost her everything. The dining room filled the same way it had 4 days earlier, senior family members arriving in careful order of status, associates trading quiet conversation before dinner, the particular practiced formality of a household that had spent decades performing control, even when nothing underneath it felt controlled at all. Grace arrived early, positioning herself near the head of the table the way she always did, and Odessa watched her face change the moment she walked through the door beside Taemin, not as staff returning quietly, not as a scandal being managed privately, but seated deliberately at his right hand, Jun Seo between them, holding his mother's hand in front of everyone the way he'd wanted to for 4 days. "I want to thank everyone for gathering tonight," Taemin said, once the room had settled, his voice carrying the particular authority that made conversations stop without him raising it. "There's something I should have said clearly 3 days ago, before I let embarrassment and bad information make a decision I'm still paying for. The room went quiet in the specific way it does when everyone senses something important is about to happen and nobody wants to be the reason they miss it. 7 years ago, a woman left a newborn baby at the gate of this house with a note explaining that the child was mine. We confirmed it then with a DNA test. We never found the mother because she made sure we couldn't. He looked at Odessa, something steady in his expression now that hadn't been there 4 days earlier. 2 years ago, that same woman applied for a position in my office under circumstances that concealed her identity, not out of malice, but out of fear for her son's safety in a world she understood, correctly, to be dangerous for anyone connected to this family. A murmur moved through the table. Grace's composure had already begun to crack, watching a script she thought she'd successfully rewritten collapse in real time. 3 nights ago, I fired that woman in front of most of the people sitting at this table, based on incomplete information and a suggestion from someone who understood exactly what she was protecting me from and chose silence anyway, because that silence served her better than the truth would have. Every eye at the table turned toward Grace. "I don't understand what you're implying," Grace said, though her voice had lost the smooth authority it usually carried. "I'm not implying anything," T-Min said. "I'm stating it plainly. You suggested I make her firing public specifically because her closeness to my son threatened the position you've spent 3 years building in this family. And when the truth came out anyway, when a folder of evidence proved she'd sacrificed a significant business deal specifically to protect Jun Seo from a threat she'd identified before anyone on my own security team noticed it, you responded not with an apology, but with a rumor campaign designed to make her disappear a second time. That's not what happened." "A message reached her 3 days ago," Odessa said, speaking for the first time, her voice steady despite every eye in the room shifting toward her now. 3 words. "We found you," sent by someone connected to Sunwoo Beek, the same man whose surveillance around my son's school triggered this entire crisis in the first place. "The rumor you started reached exactly the wrong people, Grace, faster than either of us could contain it." Grace's face had gone pale, the calculation behind her eyes shifting rapidly, searching for an exit that no longer existed. "I was protecting this family," she said finally, her voice thinner than it had been 4 days earlier. "You were protecting your place in it," T-Min said, echoing the same words he'd used the first time, cold and precise. "There's a difference, and everyone in this room understands it now, whether you're willing to admit it or not." Nobody at the table spoke in Grace's defense. Odessa watched the same faces that had recalculated their assumptions about her twice, already in the span of a week now turn fully, finally, against the woman who'd spent 3 years engineering exactly this kind of room to work in her favor. "You'll no longer have a place inside this family's business or its home," T-Min said, "effective tonight." Grace looked around the table one last time, searching for allies she'd once been certain she had, and found none. She stood slowly, whatever dignity she had left keeping her spine straight, even as everything she'd built collapsed around her, and walked out without another word, the same way Odessa had walked out 4 days earlier under circumstances that felt, in this moment, like they belonged to an entirely different life. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after the door closed. Then an older relative, one of the same people who'd watched Odessa's public humiliation 4 days earlier without objection, cleared his throat carefully. "So this is officially what exactly, T-Mins?" "She's Odessa," Jun Seo said, before anyone could finish the question, his small voice cutting through the formality of the room with the particular certainty only a child manages. "She's my mommy." Nobody corrected him this time. Nobody needed to. T-Min looked at Odessa across the table, something steady and unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there the first time she'd walked into this room as a stranger applying for a job 2 years earlier. "She's the mother of my son," he said, to the whole table, without hesitation, without the careful diplomatic phrasing he might have reached for a week ago. "And I intend to spend whatever time it takes proving to her that this family is finally safe enough to be honest in. Odessa felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 7 years, watching a room full of people who'd questioned her worth twice in a single week now simply accept, without further argument, exactly who she was and exactly what she'd sacrificed to protect the boy sitting between them. There was no dramatic reversal left to stage, no enemy left standing to defeat, just a table full of people finally understanding a truth that had been sitting quietly in front of them for 2 years, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, or finally safe enough to say it out loud. 6 months later, the Yoon estate looked the same from the outside, the same gates, the same careful gardens, the same quiet authority radiating off every stone of it. Inside, almost everything had changed. Odessa didn't work as anyone's secretary anymore. She didn't need to. She had a wing of the house that was hers, a title that meant something honest instead of something borrowed, and a 7-year-old who no longer needed to run through hallways screaming a word to make it true, because everyone in that house already knew. Sunwoo Beek had been dealt with within weeks of that dinner, the threat dismantled quietly and completely by a man who no longer waited for permission to protect what mattered most to him. Grace Su's name never came up at family gatherings anymore. Nobody missed her. Junseo had started sleeping through the night without checking twice that Odessa's door was still open down the hall. He laughed more. He'd started drawing dragons again, better ones now, and he no longer hesitated before showing them to his father, because Taemin had learned, slowly and imperfectly, exactly how to sit on the floor and ask the right questions instead of standing in the doorway waiting to be impressed. "You're late," Odessa said one evening, finding Taemin in the doorway of Junseo's room, watching his son finish a drawing at the desk, instead of announcing himself the way he once would have. "I'm learning to wait outside a room instead of walking into it like everyone owes me their attention." He said it lightly, though there was real effort underneath the joke. 6 months of practice showing in small ways he still wasn't fully comfortable namming out loud. "That's progress." "Barely." She smiled, and he watched her do it the way he'd learned to watch her over the last 6 months, carefully, gratefully, like a man who understood exactly how close he'd come to losing this entirely over one bad 90-second decision in a dining room. "I have something to ask you," he said, "not about Junseo, not about the business, just you." Odessa raised an eyebrow. "That's new." "I'm told I'm capable of learning." He took a breath, something almost nervous crossing a face that rarely showed nerves to anyone. "Would you have dinner with me? Not a family dinner, not a strategy meeting disguised as one, just dinner." "We've had dinner." "Not like that." She studied him for a long moment, long enough to make even a man used to commanding rooms shift his weight slightly. And then she smiled the way she'd smiled the first time he'd asked her opinion on something and actually meant it. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he exhaled, something like relief passing over his face. "I'll pick you up. I'll meet you there." He laughed, real and unguarded, the sound still slightly unfamiliar, even to him, after a year defined mostly by grief and control in equal measure. "Of course you will." Behind them, Junseo held up his finished drawing without looking up from the desk. 2 figures standing beside a smaller one, a dragon curled protectively around all 3. "This one's us," he said simply, like it needed no further explanation, because it didn't. Odessa crossed the room and crouched beside him, the same way she'd crouched beside a 5-year-old drawing dragons nobody else in the room had bothered to notice, 2 years and an entire lifetime ago. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it completely. If this story moved you even a little, drop a comment telling me what part hit hardest, because stories like this only keep coming when I know they're actually reaching someone. Subscribe if you want more of these, hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next story.